Okay, we're just about done with our interview setup, but we're still not ready to roll tape. Not only haven't we set up our microphones yet, which isn't actually covered in this video, we haven't given any thought to exposure, f-stop, and depth of field. These are topics not usually covered in DVDs or books on video lighting, but controlling exposure and depth of field is nearly as important as the lighting itself and are key components in creating a nice-looking interview or headshot. Now, as I said before, to make this a good-looking interview, we want the subject to stand out from the background. One way we've done this is by putting as much empty space as we can between Jamie and the wall behind her. A second thing we've done is to keep the background darker than Jamie's face. A third thing is that we've used a backlight to separate her from the background. And the fourth thing we can do is to set the aperture of the lens to the maximum f-stop so that we get the shallowest depth of field possible. We want Jamie to be in perfectly sharp focus, but we also want the background to be as much out of focus as we can possibly get it. When you watch any of the high-end network news magazines, notice that the backgrounds are almost always indistinct and out of focus. That doesn't just happen by accident. To achieve that look, it takes a conscious decision by the cameraman or lighting director to get it looking that way. Almost without exception, you want the iris of the camera lens to be open to its maximum f-stop in order to minimize the depth of field. Compare these two shots. They are both properly exposed, but one is being shot at f2 and the other at f5.6. Notice how much more of the background is in focus in the shot on the right. That's an example of too much depth of field, and it shouldn't be acceptable in your interviews. It's beyond the scope of this video to go into how to adjust the manual exposure settings on your camera. But for now, just take my word for it that for shooting interviews, your shutter speed should be kept at 60, your gain turned off, and your f-stop set within a stop or two of the largest setting. Unfortunately, that might or might not give you a correct exposure, so if not, what do you do next? Well, if your shot is underexposed, then you'll need to move the key light closer to the subject to get more light on the person. However, a much more likely problem is that your shot will be overexposed after you open the iris all the way up, and there are several ways of fixing that problem. But remember, our goal is to use the largest f-stop to minimize the depth of field, so irising down is not an option. Also, we don't want to change the shutter speed of the camera either. You don't really want to use the shutter speed on a video camera to control the exposure, because a faster shutter speed will have unwanted side effects whenever there's motion in the frame. The first thing to do is to try to move the key light further away from the subject. Did you know that if you move a light so that it's twice as far away from the subject, the intensity of the light striking will drop by 75%? You might think that doubling the distance would make it half as strong, but that's not the way light works. If you double the distance, the strength of the light will be 1/4 what it was at the first position. That's a big difference and will usually be enough to solve most overexposure problems right there. You can also try putting a lower wattage bulb in the key light. For example, if a 700 watt bulb is too intense, try a 500 watt or even a 300 watt bulb instead. Another trick is to change the angle of the key light so it's not shining directly towards the subject's head. Rotate the softbox a few degrees so the bulk of the beam is passing in front of the person's face and only the trailing edge of the light is actually hitting them. You can also use neutral density filters to cut down the amount of light entering the lens. It's like putting sunglasses on the camera. You can either use the built-in ND filter of the camera or a glass filter in front of the lens as we are doing here. And finally, on some cameras you can actually program the gain switch to a negative setting, thus making the camera less sensitive to light. You're probably used to using the gain switch to shoot in low light, but on some cameras you can do just the opposite in bright light. On this camera, we can set the gain to -3 dB, and that makes about a 1 f-stop difference in the exposure. See if your camera can do that too. The bottom line is to do whatever you need to do in order to shoot the interview at the widest possible aperture, because a narrow depth of field will really make a big difference in the overall look of your shot.